Hey guys, what's up? It's Alec Torelli. Welcome back to an episode of the Hand of the Day. In this hand, we're going to take a look at what I believe is the most interesting bluff at the WSOP main event final table between Garry Gates and Ensan. Super interesting hand. Check it out right here on the Hand of the Day.
Hand of the Day.
Thanks for your attention and joining. If you're new to this channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because more awesome content is coming your way about the main event, hand reviews that I'm sharing right here, so be sure to stay tuned for that. For now though, let's jump into the hand at question. We are five-handed in the WSOP main event at the final table, and the action with 800,000, 1.6 million blinds with a 1.6 million big blind ante gets folded around to Garry Gates on the button, who looks down at the ace-10 offsuit. Now here, preflop strategy is very clear. You're definitely going to want to be opening here. Again, he might play a little bit tighter here on the button than normal, just because he is the second biggest stack against Ensan, who's the only other player that can bust him in the big blind. So Ensan might have a little bit more incentive to 3-bet wider here and just put pressure on Gates, who's going to have to fold because of ICM. But all that strategy aside, ace-10 is definitely qualifies as an open, and he decides to do that, making it 3.5 million, a little bit over 2x, which is pretty standard sizing at this table. Really not much to say about that. Folded around to Ensan in the big blind with the king-9 of spades, who I think has a pretty clear call here. While occasionally he's going to want to be 3-betting in this spot just in general because of the fact that he covers Gates and he could apply pressure on him, with a hand like king-9, it plays a lot better as a call. Doesn't really want to get 4-bet and then kind of have to call, kind of have to fold, and then be in a situation where a lot of Gates's calls end up dominating Ensan's 3-bet. So Gates might call with better kings or better like ace-9, whereas when Ensan just calls, he keeps all of Garry's worse 9s and kings in the pot, and he could potentially dominate him and win a big pot post-flop. So I think this hand plays a lot better as a call. Ensan does. Let's take a flop. With a pot of 9.4 million, the flop comes down king 8-5 with 2 clubs. Ensan flops top pair of courts. Garry with not much. Backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw, but not really much going on. Ensan checks, which I believe he's going to do most of the time here. Even though he had been leading out occasionally in spots like these, I believe he's going to be checking here most of the time, which I think he should do with a weak king on this flop. Very, very standard. Now over to Gates, who has a tough decision in this spot. Ace-10 is kind of one of those in-the-middle types of hands. You don't really get many better hands to fold. In fact, you don't get any better hands to fold. And you get some worse hands to call, but not many. One of the biggest problems I have with betting a flop like this is even if your opponent has a worse hand and calls, you still don't win the pot. So even if he has something like 6-7 and Ensan check calls, you know, the turn blanks off and it goes check, check, and then the river blanks off and Ensan bets, and you have to kind of fold your ace-10 anyway. So even though you do get some like value from these worse hands that can call you, in practicality, you don't end up winning the pot. So ace-10 is kind of a tough bet here. If you're going to bet a hand like ace-10, which I'm okay with some of the time, adopting a betting frequency with ace-10, like 20-30%, I think makes sense. But you have to have a plan for the hand. I think just one and done with ace-10 doesn't really make sense. I'd like to see Garry bet a hand like ace-10 here if he's going to bet when he picks up more equity. If the turn comes a queen and Ensan checks, I'd like to see ace-10 take a second stab and try and put pressure on a draw or an 8 or a 5 and get those hands to fold, double barreling the turn with a lot of equity. The same thing if the turn comes like, let's say, a jack of clubs. It could be a great card for Gates to bet again, picking up a straight draw, picking up a flush draw, putting pressure on those middling pair type hands or those straight draws that are now going to have to fold out their equity. The biggest case, I believe, for betting a hand like ace-10, aside from the potential to double barrel with some bluffs, is just to fold out some equity that would bluff you on the turn. So for example, let's say Ensan has something like 9-10. If Gates checks the flop and the turn comes a 7 or a 6, Ensan just bets, Gates kind of has to fold, and he folds out the best hand. So by adopting a betting strategy, you kind of make the hand easier to play, and you could win the pot, whereas if you check, you might get bluffed off the hand, especially from a player who has the tendency to bet a lot when it's checked, like Ensan with the chip leader, who's been betting a lot in spots when other players show weakness. All in all, I'd probably lean towards checking, but I am okay with betting here from Gates, and I would do it with some mixed strategy. So some percentage of the time that's non-zero I would bet, but my overall strategy would probably be to check a little bit more than I would bet. As played, Gates decides to bet 2.3 million, which I think is a pretty good size. If you're going to bet here, this is enough to get those bad types of hands we talked about, like 9-10, just to fold, right? It's also a bet that could get, a call from a weak hand, like a gut shot or whatever. And then if you do bet again on the turn, you can sort of get those hands to fold regardless. So I don't think you really have to go 6 or 7 million here. The small bet size accomplishes the same thing, and it's just wasting chips and inefficient, I think, to bet bigger most of the time. So I like this small bet size from Gates. Over to Ensan, who could kind of make a case for raising when you do open the button and bet really small. I think a GTO strategy would say raise these weak top pairs some of the time because you want protection, and because your opponent's range is just so wide, you can get a lot of value from it. Whereas if Gates had opened under the gun, I think this King 9 would be a clear call on the flop. But all in all, that said, main event final table with the only other stack that could kind of put pressure on you and really cause you to lose a lot of chips and put you in a tough spot, I think I would take the default line here, which is just a call, play pot control, just get to showdown, play this hand, maybe win a bet on the turn of the river, and just take a more standard line. Don't want to open this up to potentially getting 3-bet bluffed on the flop, not really know what level my opponent's going to be thinking on if I do check raise. So I would just call, take a turn. That's what Ensan does, and let's take a turn. With a pot of 14 million, the turn comes down to 6 of clubs, giving Ensan a gut shot and Gates now a backdoor flush draw. Ensan checks, which I think is totally standard here, and now it's over to Gates, who kind of has a tough decision. I would like betting for sure on a club that's like a deuce or a queen, because the deuce of clubs doesn't help any hands that your opponent can call the flop with, and the queen or a jack give you a gut shot as well, and they're also overcards to the 8 and the 5, which is definitely going to make your opponent fold those small pairs. The 6 of clubs is kind of a tough card, because even if your opponent has a hand like 8-7, 6-5, 6-7, 5-7, 8-9, all those types of hands, they're a lot more likely to have picked up equity on the turn. So the turn gives the big blind's range a decent amount of equity a large part of the time. And because of that, I feel like Gates's turn bet is going to work less than if this was a different club. That said, I'm still going to lean towards betting if I'm Garry, because it's like you bet the flop, you picked up equity. If he does just have a hand like Queen 5 suited, he's going to fold it. He's going to fold a random 8. He's going to even fold maybe a random 6, like 9-6 of diamonds. He's going to fold that as well. So there's just too much to gain by betting. And even if you are called, your ace is probably good almost always. Your 10 might be good some of the time if your opponent has something like 8-9 or 8-7, and your club is good most of the time too. So it's not it's not terrible if we're called. We're not like bluffing with no equity. We still have a lot of equity when called. So I think all in all, this has to be a bet. Gates decides to bet, goes for 6.5 million. I would probably go a little bit bigger here, just because I would want those middling type random combo draws to fold. And if I bet 6.5, a hand like 8-9 with no club might talk itself into a call. A hand like, 6-9 or something like 6-7, those hands might call. Whereas if I bet like 9 million or 10 million, they might just be like, it's too tough of a spot, I'm just going to fold. So I think this is a spot where, contrary to on the flop, where the additional chips don't really help the bet that much, I feel like adding a couple million here to this bet really might make the difference between Ensan, who can be sticky here because he can afford it, potentially making a hero call, shifting over to making a hero fold just because the bet size is a little bit bigger. I'd like to see about 9 million here. I'm okay with 6.5, and that's what Garry ends up doing. Over to Ensan, who now I think has a very clear call. Picks up a gut shot, still ahead a decent amount of the time. He could even be up against a worse king, where Garry's just betting to get to showdown with a worse king. Has a very, very clear call here. Not much to say about that. He calls, let's take a river, where things get interesting. The river comes down to 10 of spades, and now Ensan has a super clear check. Typically, you don't want to be leading here on this river with anything. I don't feel like people really lead this river at all, but this is definitely not a hand to lead here on the river. It's one of those hands where you have a bluff catcher. Gates is basically saying, I have a big king or a flush or 2 pair or a straight or a set. Otherwise, he's bluffing with a combo draw. And so betting with a hand that is going to get air to fold and better hands to call or raise really doesn't make any sense. Like, it's not like Gates is going to, have a hand here like ace-8. He's not even going to have that. But even if he did, he's probably not going to hero call with that anyway. Whereas if he has a better hand, he's going to raise. And if he has a better hand that is like king-queen, he's just going to call. And so it doesn't really make much sense here to me to bet here from Ensan. I don't really understand what he's trying to accomplish. He doesn't really get worse hands to call. He doesn't get better hands to fold. If Garry does have something like ace-king, he's going to call this river for sure. It's a third pot bet. So it's 9 million basically into 27 million. Gates is getting 4 to 1. He's not going to be folding some top pair, top kicker type of hand, or two pair, or a set, or a straight. So I don't really understand. But what the problem with this bet does is that it opens up the door to a hand that Garry was betting as a bluff to now raise. What if Gates has something like ace-jack with the ace of clubs? Like, he can't call, but he can raise with this hand and use his blockers to represent a hand like a flush. The other problem here with betting from Ensan is not only does he have no blockers, but it's unlikely, in my opinion, he's going to take this line with a flush. If he had a flush, I think he would just either raise the turn or go for a check raise on the river, or maybe just a check call on the river, but at least allow Garry to bluff with these combo draws or bet a hand that's worse for value, and then maybe, depending on his sizing or the strength of his flush, go for a check raise or a check call. So I don't feel like Ensan has a super strong hand here. He might have rivered two pair with something like king 10. I could definitely see king 10 taking this line. I could see 10-8 taking this line as well, or maybe something like 10-6, no, 10-5 with the 10 of clubs, if he can even have that, taking this line. But there's not that many hands here he's leading for value, and most of them are not super premium. So over to Gates now, who actually is in a very interesting spot. Because Gates, and we're going to get a little in depth here with some blockers, but this is an important thing to keep in mind in spots like these. Because Gates has a 10 in his hand and the 10 of clubs, this is a spot where some of the hands that Ensan has for value that are leading are blocked by Gates's hand. So again, because Gates has the 10 of clubs, Ensan is much less likely to have something like king 10 or 10-8, which comprise a decent amount of the value range that he's leading. Because he has the 10 of clubs, Ensan is also a lot less likely to have a random flush. Garry blocks some of those hands. So I think over to Garry here, I think he actually has a pretty clear raise. Where I was a little bit maybe skeptical about betting the flop, I think here a raise is definitely the correct play. You can't really call for fear that your opponent might have you beat, but you can easily rep a flush. Garry has a lot of flushes here, raising the button. It makes a sense that he can have a flush. He raised preflop on the button, he bet the flop, he bet the turn. Flush draws are in his range, and when he has the 10 of clubs blocker that blocks some of his opponent's value and his flush combos, and he has a hand that's not strong enough to call with, a raise is a great play. So Garry makes it 24.5 million, and I love the idea of the raise here, but here's where I have a little bit of a potential adjustment about the play. I think this raise is just too small. If Gates has a flush, he wants to put a lot of pressure on a hand that he's trying to get to fold, a hand potentially like a two pair, and he makes it so cheap for that hand to call. The pot is now like 60 million and his opponent's calling 15. His opponent's never going to fold a hand that has some showdown value, I don't think. It's just he's getting too good of a price. Had Garry made it 35 or 40 million here, I think his raise has a lot more leverage. It puts a lot more pressure on his opponent, and he's definitely going to have to think twice about calling with a weak king or even a hand like two pair. Garry Gates has been super quiet in this spot. He hasn't taken any out of line action. He hasn't been bluffing excessively. It's unlikely he's going to go big in a bluff against the chip leader. I think all these psychological exploitative factors make this a great spot to raise. I would just have loved to see 35 to 40 million because I think it makes it so much more likely that Ensan is going to fold. Let's take a look at the results and wrap this up. Ensan calls instantly, power to him. It's almost like he can see the cards. I mean, it doesn't really make sense to bet out, but it feels like he was betting to actually induce this raise from a hand that could have been a bluff. Power to him. He read the situation well, called it immediately. That's what makes him one of the best players and world champion, well deserved. Be sure to subscribe to this channel. Leave your thoughts in a comment below. More videos are coming out about the final table, the most interesting hands. They'll all be right here on the hand of the day. I look forward to your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for your support. I'll see you guys in the next one.